The authorities in Burundi have blocked off social media access amid heightened protests against the current president, Pierre Nkurunziza. Now, without messaging and access to social media sites, citizens obviously have access to a lot less information. But will this make things a lot worse or just keep them under pressure for a little longer? We'll be answering that question live from Bujumbura shortly. Right now, though, welcome to Global Business. I'm Ramanyang. Here's what's coming up. Workers across the continent have observed Labour Day, May Day or International Workers' Day. And when high temperatures bring good tidings, we'll be looking at watermelon farmers and their good yields in Egypt. Let's start in the Central African country of Burundi, where the government has blocked off social media messaging amid a wave of political protest over President Pierre Nkurunziza's plans to run for a third term. Opponents, of course, have been using the technology to coordinate protests, which are the largest since the civil war in the country ended 10 years ago.
Burundi's authorities have cut off certain social media and radio networks in a bid to hamper further protest over the president's decision to seek a third term in power. At least 5 people have died since the start of protests, sparked when the president announced he would run in upcoming elections in June. Under the national constitution, presidents can only be elected to 2 terms in office. However, Mr. Nkurunziza's supporters argue his first term does not count as he was appointed by parliament. Social media messaging services have been used to coordinate the protests. Traditional media has also been affected. Africa Public Radio, popularly known as Voice of the Voiceless, is one of 3 radio stations whose broadcasts were cut after giving airtime to protesters. Residents say they now have little access to information.
This was the only means left to get information after Africa Public Radio, Ngozi and Bujumbura were shut down, followed by the closure of social networks. No more WhatsApp, Viber, etc. No connection. It's sad because if there's no information, then we can't keep up with what's going on around us.
The power of social media in mobilizing popular opposition has been apparent since it helped fuel protests across the Middle East that resulted in the Arab Spring at the beginning of the decade.
Communication has been cut off. Mothers can no longer communicate with their children. Have mercy if you hear me. I know they too are parents.
President Nkurunziza has ruled for 10 years since the end of the 12-year civil war in which more than 300,000 people lost their lives. Wazir Khamsin, CCTV.
Now, here's what's adding to Burundi's turmoil. The capital of Bujumbura now faces fuel shortages right alongside those 5 straight days of protests. The government says it has had to raise taxes on fuel to bolster its tax revenues and to cover its spending, given a significant decrease in donor support in the nation. That, of course, was caused in part by an economic slowdown in donor countries, as well as concerns of a graft and human rights abuses. The security fears have seen residents rush to withdraw large sums of money as well to keep them going over the next couple of days, while the fuel shortage has seen locals queuing for hours amid the unrest in Bujumbura's police stations.
I've been here since 11 a.m. I came to get petrol because I can't find it anywhere. We have been waiting here, but we still don't have anything. As you can see, there are chaos there. We have been waiting all morning and still don't have anything.
I had to come and withdraw all the money so that I can try to use the little money I have to survive. I live in Musaga, which has been the center of many of the protests, and we are struggling. Sometimes we can't even find food to eat.
And of course, the confidence loss on the banks would certainly be a catastrophic event. Let's get the latest now from Bujumbura. Jen Kyo has been there covering the protests, covering the developments in the Central African state for us. Jane, what's the current atmosphere in Bujumbura like right now? All right, it seems that we've just lost her on the line from Bujumbura. Let's move on to South Africa. Workers in the country have marched in traditional May Day celebrations throughout the nation. This year's event, however, comes amid a series of critical wage talks for public sector and mining unions. Angela Kuppala found this report from Orkney in South Africa.
The labour movement here is under pressure. There are internal wranglings, expulsions and new groups forming. The public sector is deadlocked with government on wage talks, and negotiations in the mining sector are about to start. And on what is arguably the most important day in their calendar, unions organised marches and meetings in Johannesburg, Durban, Cape Town, and in the small mining community of Orkney.
Let us remember that this is May Day. This is International Workers' Day. You as miners from South Africa, have a common bond with other workers throughout the world.
Part of that common bond is salaries. Unions generally fight for workers' rights to ensure that they have a living wage. Unions have been working tirelessly, fighting against a government that they were partners with before 1994.
I think it will be quite much unfair to take all this work on the shoulders of AMCO. If the country, the government itself, doesn't stand up for its own people to see that the shackles of economical oppression is dismantled, AMCO is just a union. But we are doing our bit as a union, as AMCO, to conscientize the people to say, yes, we might be politically free, but we are not economically free.
The Tripartite Alliance, which sees the ANC partnering with unions and civil society, had a role prior to 1994.
Once you pass the stage of being a revolutionary movement, you're becoming a capitalist. Government is the biggest capitalist, it's an employer at the end of the day. So there is a conflict of interest inside.
May Day is traditionally a workers' celebration day. It's a time to look back on the past, and it's a time to look forward. What we're seeing right now, though, is the country is about to enter wage negotiations in the gold sector. It's sure to be a bit of a messy environment because we're hearing talks of 75% increases across the board. We don't know what the details are just yet, but we will find out in the next week or two. I'm Angelo Coppola for CCTV in Orkney, in South Africa.
Let's get more data from Angelo Coppola. He's live in Johannesburg at the moment. Angelo, earlier today, COSATU had its march in Durban, and 8 other former affiliate unions also happened to have their marches in Durban too. The authorities had banned those, however. They were concerned about potential violence between the two sides. What evidence did they have to validate those concerns?
Well, Raman, there was always going to be the potential for conflict, and one wonders why the authorities in Durban decided to allow the 2 meetings and 2 marches to happen on the same day at more or less the same time in the first place. Tensions are always high when rival unions get together like this. And happily, though, the SAP's regional spokesperson I spoke to late this afternoon confirmed that there was no public order issue at all today. It seemed to have run very smoothly. Of course, we'll have to see what happens during the night because people will be celebrating and having a good time, so things might heat up a little bit later, Raman.
Indeed. You covered this briefly in your package. AMCO, of course, did engage in wage talks with the gold mining firms later this year. Last year, of course, we saw exactly what would happen, what happens rather, when AMCO and the employers don't get along in the platinum sector. What should we expect between the talks between AMCO and the gold miners?
Well, Raman, what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks is the first round of talks will start. When I spoke to Matunjwa earlier, he wasn't giving us any information. He wasn't giving us his position, the amounts that they were talking about, or any of the other package details. He gave absolutely nothing away. But he probably did sit up and take notice 2 weeks ago when the NUM data was released, showing that NUM were looking at around a 75% increase. We know that NUM will probably be presenting their demands to the Chamber of Mines on either Thursday or Friday this week. But they're also playing their cards close to the chest at the moment, Raman.
Indeed. Let's talk about the broader picture, however. Given South Africa's persistently high unemployment rate, it's been around 25% for years now, how is it that the Unemployment Insurance Fund has a surplus? Reconcile these two facts for us.
It does sound kind of strange, but basically the way it works is that employers and workers fund this fund. So they pay a small portion every month into the fund, which the state manages. Now, you had to have been employed before you can benefit from it. And you need to fall also into a particular salary bracket. And it doesn't cover the high income earners either. So you'll only get access to the fund if your employer is also paying. And then you've got to remember that you're only getting access to a portion of your salary for 9 months. It's for a fixed period. So the complication between the two is fairly straightforward. If you're employed, you can get access to the fund. If you've never been employed and you've never had an employer, you don't have access to that fund at all, Raman.
Indeed, we'll have to leave it there for the time being. We'll certainly keep tabs on that story with regard to the Unemployment Insurance Fund. There's quite a bit of debate around how it should be structured, how it should be reformed moving forward. Now, still on labour matters, let's take it to East Africa. The Kenyan head of state, Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta, has increased the minimum amount of money that workers ought to be paid in Kenya by 12%. That ends a 2-year drought that had left minimum wages fairly stagnant. The minimum wage is roughly around $130 a month right now. The country's Central Union of Trade Unions had asked for a 20% increase. The head of state cited inflation as a main reason for the rise, while Kotu wanted an increase that was in line with the rising cost of living. This year's Labour Day also marked the umbrella body's 50th year of existence. Still in the East African nation, Kenya's new mining bill is currently being reviewed in the Senate. The nation's emerging mineral sector is set to undergo wide-ranging and frankly long overdue reform. Now, these changes aim to strike a balance between boosting national prosperity on one hand, but also encouraging private sector investment on the other. Kenya's Mining Cabinet Secretary Najib Balala is in charge of the reform process. He's told the Senate committee that several mining companies operating in Kenya are simply not paying their fair share of taxes. Now, claims from the chairman of the Senate's Natural Resources and Lands Committee that base resources VAT refund claims were unacceptable, however, have upset the firm. It has actually gone as far as describing those claims as misleading. The international mineral sands miner says titanium miner says it's paid over $2.3 million in royalties since 2013. So then, is this just a case of politicians using parliamentary privilege to make misleading, unfounded statements? Or is there something fundamentally wrong with Kenya's current tax treatment of mining companies here? Let's find out. Patrick Obath is the Executive Program Director of the Kenya Extractive Industries Development Program at Adam Smith International. He's live in studio with me tonight. Thank you for your time this evening, sir. Let's start with a broader picture here. There's a separate bill that's being looked at to deal with oil and gas, the energy bill, and then there's another to deal with mining in the wider sense of the word, dealing with other commodities. Isn't there a risk of overlap and duplication here?
Not really. In most jurisdictions where you've got both types of minerals, you have separate bills and legislation to cover them. The fiscal treatments are not normally the same. And if you look at mining, the types of activities that are involved in mining compared to the types of activities that are involved in oil and gas are different. So I think it's right that the nation is going along the path of having two separate bills to cover the activities of mining and oil and gas. However, there are certain common areas, as you quite rightly say, and that is around the treatment of communities. It's common in both, around land rights and things like that. So there are such, and also areas like local content. Those areas are common across both. So those should have common legislation. But the actual act of the resources, I think it is necessary to have two separate bills.
Indeed. Let's look at the mining bill in detail now. It provides the government with the power to acquire a 10% free carried interest without paying any financial contribution in that particular instance. How does this compare to other mining laws in East Africa and Southern Africa?
I think let's look at Africa as a whole. The issue of free carry interest is a peculiar thing to Africa. You go to other jurisdictions like Australia and South America, you do not find free carry interest. Free carry interest started in Ghana in 1986 and has spread across the whole of West Africa, East Africa and South Africa as well. So it's not unusual to have a free carry interest. And my belief is because the investment opportunities for African countries into mining has never really been there because the countries can't afford it. So the easiest way to do it is to make a provision for free carry interest within the mining bills in each of those countries.
Indeed, but on the flip side of that, VAT refunds are plaguing most of corporate Kenya for years, and that of course includes firms like Base Resources, which you mentioned a little earlier. Would you support provisions to the tax code that allow companies here to net off the VAT refunds from their overall annual tax bill to the state?
This has been a request by the private sector for the last 8-10 years because the accumulation of VAT by the government is huge. The government is picking it up and using that to cover its recurrent expenditure, but in the meantime, private sector companies are actually having to borrow money to fund that gap. So the ideal situation would be that if the VAT can be refunded within a space of about 2 months, that will be fine. But if it takes longer than that, then I think it would be prudent for the country to start allowing companies to net off their VAT against what is owed.
Indeed. One last question for you, Mr. Obath. Capital gains tax. It came into force in Kenya on the 1st of January. Has it essentially rendered all new developments, especially given the fall in prices of most commodities, a lot less financially viable?
I think it depends at which point the capital gains tax is actually applied. If it's a going concern, as a viable concern, you've already got resources up and running, then capital gains tax happens in most parts of the world. When you exchange, when one company buys another, or when you sort of sell off your resources. Unfortunately, in Kenya, some instances, the capital gains tax is being applied at the exploration level. And it is not right to apply capital gains tax at the exploration level. So if you do it at that level, then companies will not invest in Kenya. So I think we need to be careful as a country that we do not apply capital gains tax at exploration level, but capital gains tax is applied after production commences.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you very much for your input, Mr. Patrick Obath. Now, we're taking a short break. Here's what's coming up next. Tourists are heading back to Egypt. The country's strategy seems to be bearing fruit. We'll be live in Cairo asking why. And Congo's good intentions failed to clear its streets of plastic bags.
This report by the African Green Revolution Alliance says climate change will slash food output. Within the next 30 years, the number of malnourished people in sub-Saharan Africa could jump nearly 40%.
We're 17 minutes into our journey across African business news. Thank you for watching Global Business Africa. Let's take you to Egypt now. The ailing tourism sector in that country is still slowly but surely recovering after the unrest in 2011. The sector used to rake in over $12 billion a year in revenue. That was, of course, before the political turmoil. But after the events of January 2011, earnings fell by over 60%. As Yasser Kim reports, however, with increased stability, tourists are coming back.
Main touristic sites in Cairo, such as the Pyramids and Cairo Museum, are witnessing a growing number of visitors on a daily basis. The government says Egypt attracted nearly 9.6 million tourists in 2014. That's 20% more than the year before, but 40% less than 2011 levels. The government has put in place a 5-year plan to increase the number of visitors.
We're developing the infrastructure of our tourism sector. We want to reach $26 billion in income from tourism by 2020, up from $7.5 billion in 2014. The target by the end of 2015 is to exceed 10 million tourists.
Restoring security and ensuring stability will go far in attracting larger groups of foreign tourists to Egypt, and the signs look positive.
I think it is safe. During my visit in Egypt, there was no problem. It was everything very good, very well controlled. There was no problem for tourists, absolutely not.
For now, Red Sea resort cities of Sharm el-Sheikh and Hurghada have witnessed the highest number of visitors, with an average 75 to 80% occupancy in 2014. Luxor and Aswan in Upper Egypt are still low at 40 to 50%, and the government is working hard to attract tourists, especially from China. But the Egyptian government is not only targeting a higher number of tourists, but a higher quality of tourists as well. There is a draft plan to place a minimum rate on hotel room prices. The aim is to bring in tourists who can spend more money during their stay. Hotels had to slash prices after the 2011 unrest to help cover their losses. Now hotel owners and government officials are preparing a gradual increase in prices to raise the overall income too. Yasser Hakim for CCTV, Cairo.
And Yasser Kim joins us now from the Egyptian capital for conversation around Egypt's tourism issues. Egypt does face a somewhat comparable problem, given the fight against militants in the Sinai to other markets like Kenya, for example. How did the Egyptian authorities manage to not have that particular violence problem affect its image abroad?
Right, first of all, you have a product, which is, is a valuable product and is in demand. But how you market the product was very essential to Egypt after 2011. Now, you've got the beaches in Sinai, in southern Sinai, and you've got the militants in northern Sinai. In reality, there are hundreds of kilometers between them. It's like two different countries, and you need to get that image through to tourists and tourist operators outside. Now, it's very, very safe in southern Sinai, and those militants are in the north, and there is no way they can reach each other. And that's how the government, through trade fairs, through marketing, has managed to get the tourists back to the beaches. Now there's a problem in Cairo, is that getting tourists into Cairo. What they do now is that if you have a week in Sinai, you can have one day at half price or even slash 75% of the price for one day in Cairo to visit the pyramids and the museum and go back to Sinai. You go to Cairo for that one day and you see that, take a tour around and you find that it's not that bad. Mm-hmm. So you're marketing Cairo, you're selling Cairo indirectly through Sinai. And as well Luxor and Aswan. So it's mainly a strong marketing strategy by the government and giving incentives to tourists coming and the tour operators in many countries to get their clients back to Egypt.
Indeed, we focused on the consumers, but what about the producers of said product? Are there any specific tax breaks or incentives that are planned for the tourism sector in order to at least boost traffic back up to pre-2011 levels?
There are incentives. The government, for taxes, for example, it does not give any discounts or decreased taxes, but you can pay on a longer term. You don't have to pay all in cash. Most of the hotels and the businesses were built through loans from banks, and the central bank has given the green light to the banks to reschedule payments for hotels and tourist industry, especially that they couldn't afford to pay the loans back on the installments during the last 3 years. So it's all has been rescheduled based on the central bank's orders to the private and public banks in Egypt, which has given loans to these hotels. The government itself is giving incentives in the form of not having to pay the insurance, social insurance to the workers directly. The government would pay it to the workers, and the hotel or the business would pay to the government over installments. Some kind of incentives to help keep this industry on its feet until things go back to normal.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, we'll have to leave it there for the time being. Thank you for your input. That's Yasser Hakim live in Cairo. Now, over in Western Africa, the Republic of Congo banned the use of plastic bags in 2011. Ostensibly, the idea then was to protect its environment in the Congo rainforest. That said, a tour of the country's streets today shows little evidence of this ban being enforced. Why? There's quite a bit of plastic garbage clogging the streets.
Authorities in the Republic of Congo banned the use of plastic bags in the country in 2011. Their aim, to protect one of the world's most important natural environments, the Congo rainforest, against pollution. But despite the ban on production, sale and import of plastic bags, their use is slowly creeping back to the Central African country. Cities like Pointe-Noire are struggling to keep their streets clean as residents and small businesses continue to use plastic bags. Residents say part of the problem is the lack of a holistic program around plastics and recycling.
Here in Congo, there are no collector bags or collection services to recycle or destroy them. It is upsetting.
As is the case in many countries around the world, Congo does not have an adequate recycling system to clean and reuse the plastic, and the sheer amount of plastic is a headache to local authorities.
The decomposition in these bags is slow when it is underground. The breakdown is not as fast as the garbage that enriches the soil. Meanwhile, the bag breaks down very slowly. It decomposes over a century, at least 150 years, at most 400 years, and contributes to soil degradation.
Plastic bags continue to be used for packing goods and for the sale of water. These bags are imported from outside the country.
At the controls, there is a kind of laxity. People who use this medium generally plead to be allowed to bring in the bags, and the police and the Departmental Direction of Trade Services are forced to show some understanding. Ultimately, you know that our borders are porous.
With the region being a crucial watershed for the rest of the world, local government needs to come up with an improved support system if such plans like the banning of the bags are to be implemented and results seen. Valde Carlsa, CCTV.
Back to Egypt again, this time to talk about watermelons. They're in season. The fruit, of course, is a seasonal treat for many. And as summer approaches, it's an easy way to cool off as the temperatures head up. Now, the ultimate winners, however, are the farmers who are smiling all the way to the bank.
Watermelons that have just been delivered from Aswan in the southeast of Egypt. Some workers roll the melons across the dusty ground, while others arrange them into pyramids. Here, speed is of the essence, as the melons have to be distributed across much of the city. Fatou Ayoub, the owner of this van, says that success in the industry comes down to experience.
I do not deal with just any melon farmers. I must know the method they cultivate under, the places they plant their harvest in, and the pesticides they use. I consider it my own harvest to put on sale every year.
Melons are big business in Egypt. Many are sold on carts by the side of the streets, where they go for 10 Egyptian pounds, just about $1.32. Vendors keen to show off their products let potential customers taste the fruit to appreciate the quality before making a purchase.
We are now in the beginning of the green melon season. It starts from the last day of March until the beginning of September. There are 5 or 4 months of melon season.
Whenever there is high export demand, street prices rise as most sellers prefer the export market. Whatever the price, it's a good way to cool off as the temperatures rise.
I love melons a lot. Every summer I used to come here with my friends to eat, as they serve it in a very nice style. It tastes awesome. We're used to this every time, and I wait for summer to come here always.
The watermelons are also popular as a cool, refreshing drink, mixed with sugar, water and ice, and served straight up. Susan Mongeli, CCTV.
And that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. No watermelons for me to give you, unfortunately, but we would like to hear from you. Feedback, send it to globalbusinessafrica@cctv.com. And of course, Facebook and Twitter are your ports of call when we're not on air. Have a good evening, everyone. See you tomorrow.